going to look at William Blake's Song of Innocence and Experience. And with that, move from the period we call the Enlightenment into the Romantic period. So let me say a little bit about the Romantic period before I look at Mr. Blake in particular as a representative of that. We're going to look at several of the Romantic poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge. We could look at others, and I would, if I had my way, would prefer to in some ways, but we have a whole course to cover. But we'll look at several authors that represent the Romantic era. And the Romantic era is loosely connected with the French Revolution in 1789. That's the dominant and most important political event in the period. And much of the poetry has a poetic expression, of course, and that's going to be the main emphasis, but also has a political angle to it. The Romantics in general are very sympathetic to the aims of the Revolution, and to some degree express a revolt against the type of poetry in its subject matter, in its notion of the hero, in its style to that of the neoclassical era that preceded it. So the heroes are not aristocrats or adult men, as most poetry has been up to this point. It will be someone other than that, not even women per se. It's more revolutionary than that. It tends to be children. It tends to be, in the case of Lord Byron, it tends to be a criminal or somebody who's a social outcast. So Blake, whom we're looking at today, will regard Milton's Satan as Milton's true hero. Not that he thinks that Milton actually intends Satan to be his hero, but he says that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, by presenting Satan as an opponent to the tyranny of God, and giving him such grand speeches that morally, if not theologically, Satan is Milton's hero. And he says the reason that he wrote in fetters, that is in chains, when he wrote of God and his angels, and wrote more freely when he was writing of, as I say, Satan and his angels, is because he was of the devil's party without knowing it. What does that mean? Well, he thinks that there is a vitality and a power that goes with breaking the forms, breaking tyranny, breaking conventions. So there's a bit of anarchy about Blake, and a bit of anarchy about the entire period. Remember, the French Revolution was a revolt of the common people against the king. They executed him, Louis XVI, and cut off his head. But then so did the English back in the Civil War. If you compare the two, the comparison is completely different. If the circumstances, other than the king got his head cut off, that is most certainly in common. But it's not a populist revolt led by the masses, more or less, which then followed another bloodletting a few years later. So in 1789, the French Revolution happened. The Bastille, which was the political prison where prisoners of the monarch were held, was stormed and the prisoners released, and then they went on to execute the king. Well, the mob leaders that led this then took power themselves. 6 years later, there was something called the Reign of Terror, in which all of those leaders started getting executed by their followers for not being sufficiently democratic. They were starting to be the new tyrants, so they got executed them, and this cycle of violence perpetuated itself, at which point the military figure we know as Napoleon Bonaparte came on the scene to basically create law and order. And with his army marched around Europe, toppling monarchies wherever he went and bringing in republican governments. So it's a very important period politically speaking. Anti-monarchical then, and to some degree anti-establishment and anti-clerical, anti-church. More anti-clerical than anti-church, but certainly anti-church as well. So that in the French Revolution, one of the pieces of legislation they passed was that the weak would no longer have 7 days, but would rather have 10. Because 10 was a more rational number. Let's order the world in accordance with. And again, so in a way, the Romantic period is an extension of the Enlightenment. It does happen in the name of reason, but the reason now is going to go against convention and against tradition and follow a more natural path. And the natural path is the law of number, which I already talked to you last time about in Jonathan Swift. There's an apparent rationality to it all. At the same time, they don't actually, in the Romantic period, appeal to reasoning. They see reasoning as alienating in some way. And the alienation is primarily one of the physical being of human beings. And the way in which we reconnect what has been severed is through our feelings. So the Romantics regularly appeal to feelings and sentiment. Whereas in the Enlightenment, they appeal to the reason. In the Romantic period, they regularly appeal to, as I say, feeling and sensibility, and regard them as extremely important. So if one is an overly rationalistic approach, which results in absolute anarchy and ethical destruction, which, as I say, represented in a modest proposal, the other leans towards irrationalism. If one's rationalism, then it's irrationalism. So the emotions are the truest expression of human nature, our feelings. So Romanticism leans in that direction. It's a revolt against the over-rational Enlightenment with, to my mind, an over-emotional embrace of anarchy. But the watchword of the whole period is not feeling, it's the word imagination. And the Romantic poets, and it's not that this had never been discussed in literature before, but the word imagination takes on a new power in this period. And the poets emphasize it so strongly that it makes us question why this word and why now? And what's the particular emphasis? And when you read the Romantics in any depth, and this is my area of expertise, you start to see that what they call imaginative writing is really self-expression, and it has almost absolute creative power. So when you write poetry, you're expressing yourself, but you're creating something out of nothing. So that our words bring forth a reality that did not exist before. Now that's the early beginning of what I think 200 odd years down the road, 220, gives rise to the idea of self-identification. My words declare my being, and it needs to be acknowledged and celebrated, etc. That tendency to think of our words as having the capacity not only to name things and know them the way Adam did in the garden. Remember I talked about that in Genesis 2:15. God parades the animals before Adam. Adam names them, and when he names them, God says that's what it is. And when he does that, the take traditionally is that there's a mastery of the animals in the sense of knowing them intimately. They know, it's a scientific judgment per se. This is different. It moves in towards, this is an emotional expression of relationship. That's an absolute one. It's not acknowledging the essence of the thing there. It's expressing my emotional appeal about it. Here's how I feel about it. Or if it comes to self-identification, here's how I feel about myself. Now, where does this come from? Blake is writing in the 1780s, 1790s, and thereabouts, but it comes before this. It comes from speculation about the origins of language in the Enlightenment period, and the thinker that is most associated with this, oops, boy, that's not very good. I don't know if I have any others. No, that's not even, no, that's not even point. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I got a marker here. I do not. Is there one on the other side? There is not. Okay, Rousseau. R-O-U-S-S-E-A-U. French thinker. And Rousseau notes of the Enlightenment that there's something about modern society which oppresses him. It crushes his spirit. It does not understand the sentiments of the heart. It imposes a sort of, remember that picture I showed you last time of the Garden of Versailles? It imposes a rationality on nature that actually contradicts something in his human spirit. It doesn't recognize the essence of him. So he's anti-rational in that sense. His feelings are being violated in some sense, or his very spirit. And how does he then go on to describe that? Well, he talks about it in terms of nature. My nature is being suppressed in the same way that the natural world is. The garden is being manicured, ordered, directed, right? In a very cookie cutter type fashion. That's what it's doing to human society as well. People are getting, if they don't fit the cookie cutter mold, those little pieces are thrown away. So there's an anti-rational or anti-enlightenment sentiment to that, and Rousseau appeals to nature as the thing that needs to be defended, including himself in that nature. So if you wanted to look at that, again, the Garden of the Palace of Versailles as an example, because you'll find it all over, it's a certain view of culture to nature, but it's the rationalistic one, it's the very mathematical one. He says that this mathematical way of looking at the natural world of which I'm a part is inhumane. And so Rousseau's explanation for how language evolves, which is also repeated by a German writer by the name of Herder, H-E-R-D-E-R, is that the earliest expressions of poetry and otherwise were essentially emotional, such that mankind in its early origins spoke in grunts and cries like we see with animals. And the emotional expression in there was palpable and real and expressed something that our modern logical language of ordering has lost. So it's a certain view of language now, but where did it originate, and how do we get to the point where our language now, even though it's very scientific and descriptive, is actually missing something of our own nature? Well, it goes all the way back to language. So language in its fundamental poetic nature is through sounds, just as I say, grunts and cries. And so there evolves, because of this reaction against the Enlightenment, a certain view of language. And it starts to fit in to what a century and a half later becomes a Darwinist view of human origins, which is that we begin effectively as animals, grunting, crying, expressing ourselves, and that over time language evolves to become more theological and poetic, like we read in Homer, and then moves to a philosophical, theological age, and then finally into a scientific age. And the scientific age is now oppressing our very human nature, so now we need to recover something of the original type of language. We need that poetic language that expresses our human nature. So it's a revolt of human nature against the Enlightenment. That's what the Romantics are doing, or trying to do. That's my sense. And then a biological explanation for that comes much later. Darwin's theory of evolution, that life evolves from primal early beginnings and evolves and becomes more and more rational, if you will. So reason comes out of emotion, and emotion precedes it, so it's more true of our very human nature than our feelings. And I would say that the disciplines of sociology, psychology, and anthropology arise out of this sentiment, which is a hypothesis, by the way. There's no evidence for it whatsoever, because to be fair, there can't be evidence. You can't have evidence of something that will leave no trace in terms of writing. What is the traces of the evidence of this? Well, it will be the writing that we have extant to us, like the Bible, like ancient Egyptian literature, like that of the Babylonians and so forth, where they've written the words down, and we see vast and very advanced civilizations. 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, very sophisticated in some ways, and they have writing preserving that. So what then, where is this deep origin? Well, it has to be in the far more remote past, and thus the age of mankind gets pushed back not to 6,000 years, but to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years to explain how we could go from emotional, non-articulate crying to the sophisticated literary, religious, and poetical forms that we have as vestiges of it. You see how this one thought will give rise to the others. And then the science will arise around it to demonstrate this. So, but as I say, it's a hypothesis which has no evidence for it, because it can't. It just explains something about ourselves that we feel is being violated by the view of human nature the Enlightenment pushes. Does that make sense at all? And so nature is seen as having something fundamentally good about it as well. Now, this is also important. Historically speaking, first of all, in Scripture, the word nature is not spoken of. It's a modern category, or actually, the word nature is used. And if you want to look into the history of the word nature, C.S. Lewis, in a little book, not much read, called Studies in Words, will give you a 50-page history of the word nature, in which he traces how differently it has been used over the various eras. But it's not in Scripture. Scripture refers to as creation, which implies a creator. The word nature suggests something that doesn't have a creator. It's just there. That's more of a Stoic concept. Very late. So Roman era. They'll talk about nature as this thing that has life. But where did it begin? We looked at that with Ovid to some degree. Right? Ovid writing in the era of the Roman Stoics. That there's a nature. And what differs between the Romantic period and the Stoic conception is that the Romantics say that whatever is natural is good. The Stoics have no such conception of nature. Nature exists, but it's a fallen nature. There are signs of distress. They do posit a golden age. Remember when I looked at Ovid, for those of you who were last semester, if not, have a look at my video on Ovid compared to Genesis, the accounts. Ovid's not quite sure where life began. Some god, and maybe it was like this, maybe it was like that. There was a golden age and it gave way to a silver age and a bronze age and an iron age. We're now in the iron age, but somewhere about way back when, nature was good. And it brought forth fruit without even any need for work. Work is a product of the fall of mankind. He doesn't talk about it in terms of the Garden of Eden, but there's a degeneration happening, and work begins when nature no longer basically throws fruit into our mouths. Like we now have to labor for it. That's a sign of a broken world, but that's the world in which we live. They don't call nature good. Good may have been way early back when. But now we don't experience that goodness. But that's not what the Romantics hold. They hold that the natural world is good, even as it is, as we experience it today. And this is the sense of nature that we hold to this very day. That whatever is natural is good. If I give you something to eat and say it's natural, you're immediately going to say, oh, that must be good for me. If I give you something that's artificial, I'll say, here, have this, it's artificial. You'll say, no, thanks, I don't want that. How come? Because we believe that what's natural is good. Without any subtlety, without any nuance, natural is good. Obviously, since there are natural poisons, that's not going to hold up very well. And artifice is just a way of constructing things, and it's not necessarily bad. But we attach to natural and artificial the predicate of good and bad, and then apply it to the world around us. Now, when we come to the poets, Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, but particularly Blake and Wordsworth, they strongly emphasize the goodness of nature, and even the divinity of nature, because that starts to get attached into nature here. So we move towards a sort of Gaia worship or nature worship that we don't find in the Enlightenment or at any period in even the pagan world. The pagan world does not regard, when I say pagan, Greece and Rome, they don't regard nature as good in this way. You don't want to go out for long walks in the woods like Jane Austen's characters do. Why would I want to do that? You don't hang out in Muskoka and sit on the dock and look at and listen to the cry of the loon as the sun comes up and feel that you're communing with goodness. Doesn't occur to them. But it does occur to us. We're the inheritors of romantic sensibilities. In biblical terms, what we are calling nature there is the wilderness. It's an uncultivated, created order, which is good because God created it, but it's not good without qualification because it's been subject to the fall of humanity, and therefore it bears the marks of that. The seasons, death, sickness, cruelty, that's in nature. Not according to the Romantics. The Romantics only see the goodness of that, and they think that the antidote to the ills of this world that Rousseau talked about, of civilization oppressing the human heart, is to go back to nature. Get rid of cities. He hates, and civilization. Rousseau is a sociopath. He thinks society is evil. We won't worry about that. Somebody's just opened a door probably. Society is evil. The individual is good. Society is evil. Now, those two terms of the individual and society are the two terms of human nature that the Romantics and the Enlightenment both recognize, and only that. The individual on the one hand, society on the other, and there are no mediating institutions between those two. What do I mean by mediating institutions? What would stand between an individual and society as a whole? The family. Family is a socialization thing, but it is in some sense also a threat to the individual, or it's part of society, and it's part of the oppression of an individual. If you take the point that the individual and his heart or his or her feelings is fundamentally good, what will contradict that and try to mold it in a different form? It's society, of course, but the family, which is an expression of that, because the adult is going to socialize the child, make the child say, you can't do this and you should do that. And so the family is seen as also a form of oppression that the child should be delivered from. How is this expressed in terms of the writing of the period?